Welcome, welcome, everyone. I'll give it one more minute just to let people in. All right. It's great to see you all. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn program, The Malaga Ship, Maine, the Global Slave Trade, and Healing Through Artistic Reclamations. And thank you to all of you watching the recording. We are so thrilled to welcome award-winning storyteller Antonio Hocha and Dr. Kate McMahon, historian of global slavery at the Smithsonian African American History Museum. You might recognize Dr. McMahon as she's one of our all-time favorite hosts and is joining us for her sixth Lunch and Learn program. And you might recognize Antonio from one of his incredible performances and talks around the state and the country, including TED Talks. My name is Maggie Summers, and I am the Program and Outreach Manager here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental, social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. A few notes before we dive into today's program. We will hear from our speakers first and tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. Please send your questions to me or Rainey Schaefer through the chat as they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many as we can following the presentation. And please, we ask that you not send messages to the speakers directly so that they can keep their focus on the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please message Rainey through the chat and she'll be able to help you out. The event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. And you can also find recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, including the rest of Kate's programs, where a number of playlists can help you focus on particular topics. So thank you so much to all of you, and Antonio and Kate, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Well, thank you so much, Maggie and Rainey and the whole team at Maine Conservation Voters for having me speak yet again. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this collaboration with Antonio. So I'm going to start off this talk today just by giving some background on the ship Malaga and the history and, beginning to introduce some of how Antonio and I came to work together on this. So I'm just going to start off briefly by talking about what is the slave trade and what is the scope of the slave trade. So globally, the slave trade started around 1500 and continued until about 1866. And that is the trade from Africa to the Americas. About 12.5 million people left the shores of Africa. About 10.7 million people landed in the Americas. And you can see here in this chart on the right, the vast majority of those people, almost 6 million people, were taken to Brazil. So Brazil was the largest single receiver of enslaved Africans in the Americas, and also had slavery until 1888. So it was the last country in the Americas to actually abolish slavery. Antonio and I met in 2020 when he was a fellow at Indigo Arts Alliance, and was told about my research on the slave trade, and in particular as it relates to between Maine and Brazil. And after hearing about this research, he was inspired to produce this piece. And it's just incredibly meaningful for me to have my research and my work um, be used as an inspiration for something that is so meaningful and so beautiful, and something that really has impacted a lot of people, a lot of young people, and a lot of others. Um, so the trade in enslaved Africans um, really was driven by waterways. And this trade was something that began with the genocide of indigenous people. And this genocide left the Europeans, the colonizing countries, wanting a labor force to work their highly profitable plantations. They turned to Africa and began exploiting existing trade relationships and created the conditions that allowed them to exploit African bodies, leading to what became chattel slavery in the Americas. By the 19th century, this system was so well established around the world that it became the basis for our economies, our racial hierarchies, and our countries. The slave trade exploded during the 18th century, reaching a peak during the years prior to the American Revolution. Despite slavery being outlawed by the state of Massachusetts, which Maine was a part of course, in 1784, and participation in the slave trade being outlawed by the state in 1786, people from Maine continued to illegally engage in the slave trade throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And what we see here is there are two images on the screen. One on the right is from a slave ship that was captured by a British naval vessel, and it is a watercolor depiction of the slave deck aboard the Alvarez, which was a Brazilian slave vessel, which was captured in 1845. And you can see the absolutely inhumane conditions that people were forced to live in during the Middle Passage, which lasted anywhere between 2 and 3 months. And, you know, we begin to, in the late 18th century, there were big pushes for abolition of the slave trade and, of course, abolition of slavery. And a lot of that came out of the American Revolution. So in 1807, the Great Britain abolished the slave trade from Africa, despite not abolishing slavery in their colonies until 1834. But you know, the United States then followed suit in 1808, and we have this incredible graphic here that came from the New York Historical Society about a celebration being led by Black soldiers on the abolition of the slave trade. So between 1808 and 1820, there were a number of laws that were passed by the United States government to continue to try to prosecute people participating in the slave trade. And so, you know, while there were few vessels that landed directly in the United States during this time period, the slave trade did continue to increase, particularly the trade to other countries in the Americas, especially Brazil and later Cuba. In 1820, during the very same time that Maine statehood was being debated in Congress, participation in the foreign slave trade was made a capital offense. So, you know, during that period between 1808 and 1820, they continued to try to prosecute folks who were engaging in the trade, either trying to bring enslaved Africans to the United States or to other countries in the Americas. However, the lack of serious penalties being enacted And the apathy of state and national governments led to the slave trade actually increasing rapidly during the 19th century, being fueled in part by the burgeoning Industrial Revolution and the world's rapacious desire for cash crops, such as sugar and cotton, which were almost exclusively made by enslaved people on plantations in the Americas during this time period. During the 19th century, New England's vessels were often the most dominant presence in foreign slave trading ports. This was because of a number of factors, including the fact that the American flag had the largest protections against search and seizure. Due to the War of 1812 and the outcomes of treaties between the United States and Great Britain, the British, who had dedicated the largest naval force in the world at that time to stopping the transoceanic slave trade, could not board American vessels. New vessels, of course, were also some of the fastest and most well-built in the world, and crews were experienced. Historian Thomas Heinrich has noted, quote, small builders in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Maine perfected the art of building sailing ships and surpassed their New England counterparts in vessel output because of lower wages and abundant timber supplies. So all of this contributed to the fact that New England vessels became the dominant force in the foreign slave trade, the illegal slave trade during the mid-19th century. It is within this context that we encounter the story of the brig Malaga. The Malaga was a 183-ton brig built in 1832 in Brunswick by Joseph Badger, who was a wealthy man from the prominent Badger shipbuilding family of Portsmouth and Kittery. I did a lot of research to try to determine whether the vessel was named after the island. And while I can't be sure whether he named it after the island or Malaga, the port, I was able to find an 1837 map that shows that Malaga was at least named Malaga Island by 1837. So it's definitely possible that this vessel was named after Malaga Island, which of course is quite a well-known place in Maine because of its history of the interracial fishing community there, who were forcibly evicted by the state of Maine in 1912, and several members of that community were institutionalized. And I encourage you, if you're not familiar with that story, to Google it. There's a lot of talks online, and I've written a couple of papers about it. At any rate, the Malaga was the first ship that Badger built, though it would not be his last. At least 5 known vessels owned or built by him entered the illegal slave trade during the 1840s and the 1850s. And you can see a sample here. The Porpoise, which I've given a talk for Maine conservation voters before, which focuses more on this vessel, the history of this vessel. So you can find that on YouTube. The Malaga, which made 2 slave trading trips at least. The Joseph Badger, which went to Cuba in 1854, the Rebecca, which went to Cuba in 1859, as well as several others, which he was either part owner of or otherwise engaged in. So he is a very prominent citizen of Brunswick. He was the president of the Penobscot Bank. He was close friends and a financial benefactor of Joshua Chamberlain. So he is really, somebody whose history had, until this research, had never really been connected to slavery and the slave trade. However, what we can see through this history is this was, an incredibly vicious and inhumane trade that he was engaged in. So the Malaga made numerous trips to Africa, the Caribbean, and South America during the 1830s and 1840s, many of these under highly suspicious circumstances. And so one thing that is difficult about studying the illegal slave trade is that we do not have ship captain's logs that have survived. We do not have insurance papers necessarily that have survived. A lot of this is because the nature of the trade, it is an illegal activity. And so very often these things were not kept. There's a lot of discussion by the British and United States Navy of witnessing these papers being thrown overboard when they were in sight of these vessels. So these things don't survive. And so it's very different than studying the period of the illegal slave trade when everything was much more regulated during that time period. So at any rate, we don't know what the nature of these journeys were to these locations. However, at the very least, they were engaged in trade that was within the economies of enslavement, meaning that they were trading goods created by enslaved people. Um, so on November 20th, 1845, the brig sailed from Boston to Rio de Janeiro. The brig arrived in Brazil and was consigned to slave trader and plantation owner Manuel Pinto da Fonseca, and the American merchant firm that was based in Rio of Maxwell Wright and Company. It sailed for Africa under the command of Captain Charles Levitt of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on February 14th, 1846, arriving in Cabinda in modern-day Angola on April 18th, 1846. Lieutenant John E. Bissam of the USS Boxer received a message from the British naval ship Action via a rowboat that had arrived through the dense evening fog that the Malaga was in Cabinda Bay under suspicious circumstances. The Malaga was boarded and its cargo was found to be consistent with that of the cargo of slave traders. Lieutenant Bissam began investigating the charter party and found that the Malaga was consigned to Fonseca. Quote, the charter party itself was similar in all respects to that which is ordinarily used to cover these frauds upon our flag. It left the port or ports of destination to be indicated by the charterer's agents. It stipulated for the conveyance of passengers, not Negroes, and the rate of charter, 1,800 mil reis, about $1,400 a month, paid for the first month in advance, the vessel being less than 184 tons, implied that the voyage was one of particular hazards. The vessel, moreover, when leaving the United States for Rio, had laid in stock provisions for a year. Her crew had been shipped for 18 months, the voyages beyond Rio to be such as the captain might direct, among which the deposition of one of the crew shows that the voyage to the coast of Africa, though not named, was understood to be included. End quote. The Malaga was chartered to Africa as support for the Senator, a slaving vessel from Boston. It had arrived with the Malaga in late February, early March of 1846, with mate John Miller acting as its master, as their captain, John Kelly, was very ill. George Kohler, a sailor from Norway who was on board the Senator, testified that Miller did not make it clear that the brig had been consigned for the slave trading until they arrived in Cabinda. The enslaved cargo was loaded quickly onto the ship by the newly arrived Portuguese crew, and they immediately got back underway to Brazil. On board the Malaga was a reported cargo of 140 casks of rum, 80 bales of cotton, 29 casks of sugar, 31 sacks of rice, lots of hardtack, gunpowder, salted provision, and 500 sacks of farina, which is a grain that was used in particular as food for enslaved people on board slave ships. So the British Navy could not be certain whether the Malaga was meant to have enslaved captives on board during this journey, and despite the suspicious nature of its presence, Lieutenant Bissam released the Senator and the Malaga. The Senator went on to take on 900 captives, with only 600 people surviving and disembarking in Brazil. Quote, 74 suffocated the first night, and more than 200 others died of thirst during the remainder of the 3-week ordeal. These massive mortality rates of more than 1/3 on some ships show the distinct difference and cruelty of the illegal slave trade to Brazil during the 1840s. The Malaga's capture in Brazil made headlines in the United States. Some newspapers, particularly those in the South, were sympathetic to Captain Levitt. 9 United States Navy sailors were put on board the Malaga, which was sailed back to Boston. On June 16, 1846, the Malaga was charged with, quote, being employed in transporting slaves from one foreign country to another. The second, that she was fitted out and caused to sail to the United States for the purpose of procuring Negroes to be transported from Africa to some port or place for the purpose of their being sold as slaves, end quote. On July 1st, 1846, the Mississippi Free Trader noted the respectability of Captain Lovett and the scant evidence that they had broken any law. Indeed, no enslaved people or shackles were noted to have been on board the Malaga at the time of its capture, while they had what was tantamount to about $35,000 per month in cash on board in modern currency. So eventually the charges were dropped against the Malaga. And there's also a very interesting suit that was undertaken against John E. Bissum by the owners that you can read more about online. It's in the National Archives. But eventually the charges were dropped against the Malaga, and the ship was sold sometime prior to November 17th, 1847. When it sailed again for Rio de Janeiro. On December 11th, 1847, it was captured off of Sierra Leone, sailing under Brazilian colors with 830 captives on board its 183 tons by the British ship, the Ferret. The captives were taken to Freetown, Sierra Leone, a British colony for repatriated Africans, meaning it was a place for enslaved Africans who were captured during the slave trade to be taken rather than bringing them back to their points of origin. At Freetown, these former captives were largely able to integrate with their new community and were part of around 4,000 enslaved African captives that were freed by the Africa Squadron near Sierra Leone between 1846 and 1847 on 13 separate slaving vessels. So if you can think of just how many were saved, there were, exponentially more who were not saved. And this is another thing about studying this period of the slave trade, is that we do not know the full scope because so many people likely got away. We only know the tip of the iceberg. We know the people who were captured and charged almost exclusively. We don't know about all of the other people who were transported illegally. So none of the crew on board the Malaga at this time faced any legal penalties, and the story of the Malaga and the stories of the enslaved people who were forced into the too small putrid hold have been forgotten in public memory. Through the interventions of historians and artistic works like Antonio's performance, we remember. These are not just stories of inhumanity and horror, but stories of African resiliency and resistance. We must continue to bring these stories back into memory to continue the unending fight toward a more just modern world. And with that, I'd like to introduce Antonio Rocha. Antonio is an award-winning performer who has performed in more than 20 countries on 6 continents and in 44 U.S. states. He was 2024's Maine Arts Commission Performing Arts Fellow for Malaga, which is a recognition that's bestowed once in a lifetime. And I will turn it over to Antonio.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thank you for making this possible. Kate, it's always wonderful to see you, and thank you, Maggie, for all the hard work and exciting work as well to getting this together, and all the participants for making it possible. I'd like Maggie, do you have that trailer? I'd like to give you guys a little bit of a taste of the Malaga performance. This was recorded a couple of years ago, so things have changed a little bit, but let's see if we can get that trailer in. Do we have sound?
Can you hear the video or no?
No.
No. Okay, let me make sure. Sure.
And if we can't do the video, that's okay. We can put some pictures.
Okay, let me try. Let's see if we can hear the sound.
Be careful! That's a heavy one. Lumberjack, Lumberjohn. Lumber Peter, Matthew too. Lumber flowing down the river to the bay. Malaga was born 1832. Well, there are sharks in the water. Malaga, sharks over the years have changed their trajectory across the Atlantic. The bodies barely hit the water, and they devour them. Some 36,000 trips. 36,000. Come on, move up! I'm up! Stop! When stories got too scary, should change them. I wish I could, but I can't. And Malaga sailed into Guanabara Bay, riding Rio, 1845. Storyteller, I'm not cut for this. It's interesting you say that, but that's exactly what you're cut for.
All right. Okay, so that gives you a little taste of the 45-minute performance that was mainly written in my residency at Indigo Arts Alliance in 2021 in October. I had met with Kate prior to that over Zoom, and she kept telling me all the data on the ship, such as she just revealed to you. She sent me her PhD dissertation for me to read and look through it. And I'm from Brazil. I grew up where Malaga arrived in 1845, and I came to Maine to study mime and storytelling. Well, actually, I came to study mime with Tony Montanaro, and then I studied theater at the University of Southern Maine. And then I started to combine mime with speaking for some of my work. Some of my work is pure mime. There's no talk involved, and some of it is narratives with movement connected to them, fused to them. And Malaga is a good example of that. When Daniel Minter from Indigo Arts Alliance mentioned Malaga to me and told me that he could introduce me to Kate, I was right away very interested because it was at the right time. It's really amazing the timing of this introduction. For many years, for my entire life until 2018, just a year before the introduction, I was extremely nervous and fearful of the subject matter. I come from a biracial family in a country where Afro descent is 56% of the population. Brazilian population right now is around 216 million. So 56% are Afro descent, and now you understand why. And this biracial family, we never talked about the enslavement of African people. We watched Roots in the 1970s, together in the living room, but we never sat around to talk about it. My father suffered tremendously so from ancestral trauma because of all the that had happened, and it propagates through generations of oppression and prejudice. And so the ancestral trauma was very much so part of the household. And so I had this this fear that I would never tell anything related to the enslavement of African people. I said, you can tell folk tales from Africa, you can tell mythology, you can tell your own personal stories. This is my own conversation inside my head. And then it is understood in Brazilian candomblé, the religion practiced by Africans in Brazil. And this was brought to Brazil by my ancestors. And then I heard it here when I was performing at NYU last fall. This performer She said, if you don't do the job the ancestors sent you to do, they're going to knock you down. And so in 2018, I was knocked down, literally. I had a nervous breakdown of sorts because of the fear just got too acute. And it was triggered by a job that I didn't want to do. And long story short, I was completely facing the origins of this fear. It lasted for about a couple of months. And in my research to heal myself, I discovered what I was suffering from and what my African ancestors had suffered from and what my father suffered from. And the fear went out about 95%. It was really incredible, the healing that took place within a couple of months. And soon after that, I started to tell stories that until then, they were like, nope, I can talk about this at home, but I'm not going to talk about it in public. And I started to tell these difficult stories. And then Daniel Minter from Indigo Arts Alliance, within the year, he goes, there's a ship called the Malaga. I know your work. You should put the story together. I can, and then he introduced me to Kate. And it was just incredible, the timing of it all. I had never done any work like this in my life. It's of historical importance, and it's of my own history as well. And when Kate was telling me, that the Malaga sailed into Rio, I said, I grew up in Rio. And she goes, well, it was consigned by Manoel Pinto da Fonseca. I said, Fonseca was a neighborhood I lived in for 3 years. I'm like, tell me more. And Manoel, it's my maternal grandfather's name, Manuel. My mom was white, Portuguese and Swiss German, and dad was black. I have actually a picture here that I didn't send to Maggie, but this is a picture of my 4-year-old self there with my mom, my paternal grandmother, and my very regal father standing there when I was 4 years old in Brazil. And so I'm like, my goodness, this is a tremendous story, and I must tell it. So, and then I went into Indigo Arts Alliance, and I started to go through the PhD. I had already read all the data on Malaga from Kate's dissertation. And as if, again, the ancestors were looking after me to complete this work, an amazing Brazilian author, Laurentino Gomes, was launching 3 volumes, 1 volume per year. So in 2021, he had 2 volumes out. The third one came out the year after, in 2022. This man, of former journalist turned bestseller, had written 3 volumes on Brazilian history alone. And then he said, I cannot write 3 volumes on Brazilian history without dedicating 3 more volumes on the enslavement of Africans in Brazil alone. So he takes up on himself, a white man of Jewish and Italian background, Laurentino Gomes, and he writes these books with information that I had never heard of before. I know the sharks changing their trajectory across the Atlantic to eat the people they'll throw overboard. If they detected that there was a sickness going on in a ship, they couldn't risk their merchandise, as I say it in the show. So they'll throw the broken merchandise overboard, and the sharks were eating them by the 1800s, because there are so many bodies. And then, for example, the children. When we watch a movie about the enslavement of Africans, they are played by adults, and I was sold on that, and that they were adults. No, they're the average age of a captive. The average age of those 12.7 million was 15 years of age. And then he hit me, and like that makes complete sense, because back in the 17, 18, 16, 17, 1800s, the old age was 45, 50 for a white person. And if they wanted somebody to work hard for 10 good years in a plantation, day in and day out, they needed, 12-year-olds. A prized possession by the Portuguese. They called it peça da Índia. It was a 12-year-old boy, for example. It was not, there were babies on these ships, babies. And so I started to get the books from Laurentino Gomes, and I read the combined 1,600 pages on Brazilian, and he does a phenomenal job with it, as a former journalist. They are page turners, and they are written in Portuguese. So again, another confirmation, it's like, okay, you got to do this job. We're going to find you a place. Indigo Arts Alliance will find you this amazing woman, Kate, who is going to feed you all this data, and you're going to read about it in Portuguese as well. So it's been really a tremendous journey. And in writing it, I had to, I think I mentioned this. I remember mentioning this to Kate on our first Zoom in 2020. I said, it sounds like Malaga has to be the main character here because she sees everything and she doesn't know about it. When I started seeing Malaga as the main character, I was like, she comes from the interior of Maine and has no idea what she's going to end up doing. And so I started to create the character of the ship. And then I created the character of her grandmother, who's a pine tree. And the grandmother, the opening scene is a crop of trees in the countryside of Maine, eager to learn from grandmother what they're going to become, because they had a rite of passage, which is, tell me, grandmother was a storyteller and grandmother Pine was also a foreseer. And so she can tell the kids, the grandchildren, you're going to be a barn, you're going to be a house, you're going to be a school, you're going to be a church. Oh, you over there, you're going to be a ship. And you're going to sail the world. You're going to see seas of green, seas of blue. And there's going to be a lot of red too. I can't figure out what the red is, but you'll find out. So I plant that seed in the beginning of the story. And then Malaga is built, as you saw in the video, and is launched. And then little by little, she starts to see what's going on. So I visit Malaga in the ship. In the story, I visit Malaga. I found a way, I won't do any spoilers here. You got to see the show. But I found a way to connect with Malaga on stage. And the blunt of it, I explained to Malaga, she's completely unaware what's going on. Why are these people in chains in my hold? Why do I carry these folks? And why do I smell like this? What is the moaning coming? And so I explained that to the ship. We engage in dialogue. And little by little, I start to transform into the ship. The more I tell the story, the more the ship is involved in the telling of the story until the final act, which is, the 1/3, the last third of the show. I am dressed I'm dressed with what was on the floor. This is on the floor. The rope and the red cloth are on the floor, creating the line, the outline of a ship. And then there's a scene, you saw a little bit of it in the video, in which I come up with the cloth and the ropes, and little by little Malaga takes hold of the story and finishes the show. Pretty much. I come back at the end a little bit after she's scuttled. So it's been really incredible to be at my age. I'm entering my third act. I've lived 60 years pretty much. I'll be 60 this year, and I tell my family, like I've lived, three acts. I'm entering the third one now, and it's really very fortunate that I've been able to come to Maine 37 years ago to study mime and theater to become a storyteller to tell this story. Really, it's been really incredible. And I would say that the whole reason why I came to Maine was to tell this story. That's the journey. That's the journey. And there are other stories. There's the story of Pedro Tovucan, Paris. And I'm working on that story now, which is going to be the second act of a two-story show. Pedro Tovucan is going to be premiere sometime this year. It's about a 15-year-old who comes to Maine from Brazil on a vessel also built by Joseph Badger, the Porpoise. And he comes as a free man to Maine, goes to Brazil as an enslaved servant, come to Maine, and he's buried 3 kilometers, like a couple of miles away from the barn in Paris, Maine, South Paris, Maine, where I came to study mime. His body's there, since 1860 when he died. And so Maine has all these stories all over the place, and it feels very good. And the healing that has come, the healing is just incredible. I discovered where I'm from actually 2 years into doing Malaga. I did my DNA testing and I discovered the tribal group that I'm from in Africa. So that fog has lifted. Even my deceased father is happy about it. He died in 1992, and not knowing where he was from in Africa. So now we know, and so it's a beautiful relationship. This relationship that I've created with the ship, with Kate, with Indigo Arts Alliance, with Meadow Dibs from the Atlantic Black Box, and all these different organizations, and the public. The public, it's taking it. I did at the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday a couple weeks ago, and 90 people couldn't get seats, which brings me to let you know that I'm doing it again at the First Congregational Church on the 28th of February at 7 p.m. 28th of February, Friday night, 7 p.m. at 301 Cottage Road. And if you go to there will be a link on this video that Maggie's going to post that you can go to Atlantic Black Box, which is an amazing organization you should know about. And you can then register for it. And also, there is a documentary that we're going to make with Kate being an advisor, a scholarly advisor, and also involved. We are in the works of raising funds to create this film about how I came across the story and how ancestral trauma healing has come to myself and my family because of the telling of the story. It's really fascinating. I used to be this very anxious person, very fearful person. I hid it well in public, but I was always simmering with fear and never really quite understood it until 2018, and then I heal and continue to so by telling the story of the Malaga ship. So it's very personal. It's a historical piece that's very personal, very close to heart, and very important, especially right now. Um, and um, and it feels good to be alive. It feels very good. Thank you. Mm.
Thank you so much, Antonio. That was so incredible. And Kate, too. We had so many questions, and you already answered a lot of them about where can I see you next? Where can the audience see Antonio, the Malaga ship story? So thank you so much. And I will make sure in the follow-up email that there's links to register for the event, the sign up form to learn more about the documentary and get updates, as well as links to Antonio's website so you can follow him on Facebook and LinkedIn, and stay connected. And you've touched on a lot of the questions that we've had, but I wanted to start with, and this is to both of you, but in what ways do you see art and performance, like Antonio's work, complementing and really expanding historical research?
Kate, that's a good one. It's a good one for you.
I think one important way is that there is, you know, the archive related to people of African descent particularly from the period of slavery is very fragmented and incomplete. What we have that has survived generally is coming from the perspective of enslavers or colonizers. And of course, museums and archives themselves often are and have been, particularly if they have existed since, the period of slavery, were built as from an extractive process, right? So, they are taking things out away from African cultures, from indigenous cultures, and bringing them into these showcases originally. And then, over the centuries, they have continued to grow, but often are coming from a predominantly white viewpoint, and things that are supporting a narrative. And so if you've spent any time in archives, you will notice that you very rarely actually get things that have survived from the perspective of enslaved people. And so, pieces like Antonio's and other works of art really help to fill in these silences within the archive. They teach us the way that these things actually impacted people of African descent, of indigenous descent, so that we can, these things can be reclaimed by these communities that were directly impacted by the histories of slavery and colonialism. And, also help for healing. I mean, you can see what Antonio was talking about is how meaningful this process of learning about this history is. And all of the documents that I have that have survived, that I have been able to piece this story together with, are from, the US Navy, the British Navy, parliamentary papers, congressional papers, and newspapers. And so all of these are coming from white people, and they don't give us the perspective of the people that were directly impacted by this history. So, I think work by artists is so critical for us to really understand how we still live with this history today, and how it continues to be embodied by people around the world. I don't know, Antonio, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think you've covered it quite well. It's very true, all very true. You know, it was the number one industry in the world in the 1800s. I did not know that until 3 years ago. The number one in the world money-making endeavor was trafficking Black people from Africa to the Americas. Loan companies, railroads, shipping, building, whether you liked the system or not, you were wearing clothes the cotton was picked by Black people. You're drinking drinks processed by Black people, So I read in a recent document. It's not. I can't quote the person. I can't remember the name of the person. That most of New England wealth came from the trafficking of Africans. Um, and Brazil. Brazil is just incredible. The coffee was the number one crop in Brazil at the time. But before I forget, I'm actually flying to Indianapolis this afternoon. I'm doing Malaga there through Indiana Storytelling Arts of, and so if you go to my website, you'll be able to see if you know any people there. I have about 10 Malaga shows within the next 3 months from here all the way to New Orleans and Canada. I'll be posting everything on my website. But any other questions?
Yes, there are plenty, and thank you so much. We'll make sure that everyone gets all the links so that they can make sure to see your show. And I wanted to say thank you so much, Antonio, for sharing so much about your story, your learning journey.
Oh, yeah, no
And
problem. That's the whole reason why I do this. Yeah.
we had a lot of questions about how has telling the story of Malaga and through that of your ancestors, has it helped you come to terms with the fear that you were referring to earlier?
Yeah, that's yeah, very much so. Like I said, it dropped considerably.
Mhm.
Um, the what happened in 2018, it literally rendered me speechless. I couldn't tell a joke, let alone go on stage. But it was like a reset button. It was, and it was it is like we're gonna reset you. You gotta, instead of running away from this, you're gonna face it. And so that was the first big step, was, as I mentioned earlier, trying to find my bearing and going, okay, all right, I'm gonna face this and understand where this comes from. Once that was understood, the fear dropped, as I mentioned, about 95% right there and then. So much so that if I hadn't had that, it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Because if I hadn't had that happen to me, I would not have written this piece. People would say, "Oh, you got to tell the Malaga piece." Daniel Minter would have said that. Kate would have given me her PhD, and I would have just filed it somewhere and gone on to other things. So, so that's a very important thing for me to mention and underline, is that that was the big push I needed. And then the story manifested itself. Now, what's interesting about it is that a few years prior to 2018, I woke up one day and I said, one day I wish to tell a story about a ship. The thought just came and went. The thought came and went. Uh, and I'm like, oh, that's what the ship is. I even thought it was going to be a pirate ship story, that I was so numb about the whole thing. I said, oh, it's going to be a pirate ship. In a certain way, it is a pirate ship. They're transporting illegally, so it is a pirate ship. Um, and and the way the story came together too was very, very interesting. The song I sing in the beginning came already written. The like completely downloaded already. Like, okay, that's the song, lyrics and rhythm and everything. I was driving the other day for 4 hours after I did a Malaga presentation in Eastport, Maine, back in September. I was driving for 4 hours, and all of a sudden I start to whistle, and I like the whistling. I'm whistling, and then I record it, and before I know it, I have a song for Pedro's show. I'm set to go. There are all these very interesting things going on, and it's really very good. When I say interesting, we can talk about metaphysics, we can talk about spirituality. The sky's not the limit here, but that would be another session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking about your process and how you came to think of all of this.
Yeah.
And we were all there are quite a bit of quite a few questions about the kind of emotional or audience responses that you've gotten while you've been performing. Because I
Yeah.
can only imagine.
It's the audience just eats it up. I've had people drive 4 hours to see it for the third time. And I don't say this, it's hard for me as a performer and writer of the show to say these things. So I'm just speaking about the reaction since you asked. I'm not tapping myself on the back or anything like that when I say that. But the audience they just love it. They're dead silence at the end. They stay for 30 minutes asking questions during the talk back, and they come and they bring friends, and then they come again, and they're like, I didn't get everything the first time, I'm coming again for a second time. So it's I've never written anything like this before, and I cannot take at the same time that I say I wrote it, I can't take full responsibility that I wrote the piece completely on my own, because given what I've just said a few minutes ago, it's really um, I wear it. I wear the show. That's how I see it. I put it on, and then at the end, it's like walking out of a hot sauna. It's like cleansed, layers of trauma just going up to heaven to be neutralized. Yeah.
That is beautiful. And I'm one of those people that have seen it at least twice. So I know what you mean. Every time I see it, it's such an incredible story and performance, and you can feel all of the heart that you put into it. And so I definitely recommend everyone to be able to watch it.
Yeah. And
I
if you want to be a part of the documentary, you can be an executive of sorts by donating towards it. Uh,
Yes,
but any other questions?
I wanted to end with what do you hope that people are taking away from this event? How can we make sure that stories like this aren't forgotten?
Yes, that's a people take away from this event what they're ready to take away, right? We can only listen to what, I can only speak from experience. I can only take what I can see. And there's a lot that we don't see around us. And so I bring a lot of things to the show that I did not know before. It's like, wow, that really happened. Whoa, there were kids. Whoa, the sharks were eating kids. All the suffering that you hear about, that you see in movies, they were done to 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds. I'm like, so I want people to take with them this story, this history, and realize, what else don't I know about? What else is hidden in my backyard? Because this is New England's backyard. This is Brazilian's backyard. This is the America's backyard. So if you go digging in our backyard, what are we going to find? What else is out there? I was 22 years old when I came to the US to study mime. It set my life on course, and I was completely oblivion to all this, and so that's why I say it's a good time to be alive. It's always a good time. If you're alive, there's this meditation I do that says, believe in the divine purpose of your existence. In this meditation, believe in the divine purpose of your existence. And that's, we're all like that. Everybody here listening, everybody walking, all the 8 billion of us on earth, we have a divine existence. And sometimes if we are not aware of it, we'll continue to walk blindly in fear. And the fear can get so acute to the point that you might cause harm to other people. I'm not speaking of my own fear thing, but I'm talking about when you see atrocities being done, they are done because of fear. That's why we need to heal everybody as fast as we can. And I believe in the healings, the healing of the self in itself propagates the healing of the whole, right?
Yeah. That is so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much to both of you. This has been incredible. And I know that we're going to get lots of reaching out after asking, where can I see this? So thank you so much to both of you. And I just wanted to say, I hope to see you again in 2 weeks when we're joined by Professor Bridie McGreevy, who is a professor of environmental communication at the University of Maine. And she'll be talking about how we are going to shift crisis narratives to practices of care and how that'll support ongoing climate adaptation in Maine and specifically our soft shell clam fisheries. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.